The winter of 1988 arrived early in Bellridge, Montana, a town so small it barely warranted a dot on most maps. Population 3,214, one main street, 3 churches, a single grocery store that closed at 6 p.m. sharp, and a diner that served the same meatloaf special every Thursday for 30 years straight. It was the kind of place where everyone knew everyone, where doors stayed unlocked, and where the biggest crime in recent memory had been when Tommy Breslin stole a case of beer from his father's garage in 1983. Nothing bad happened in Bellridge. Nothing, that is, until the night of December 7th, 1988, when the Hartley family disappeared without a trace. The house at 447 Pinewood Drive sat at the edge of town, a modest 2-story home with pale yellow siding and white shutters that Katherine Hartley repainted every 3 years like clockwork. A maple tree dominated the front yard, its bare branches scratching against the bedroom windows when the wind picked up. The property backed onto dense forest, the kind that stretched for miles into the mountains, and where hunters sometimes got turned around and locals warned their children never to wander after dark. Robert Hartley worked as a mechanic at Dunlap's Auto Repair, a job he had held for 16 years. 42 years old, with calloused hands and a quiet demeanor, he was the kind of man people described as dependable but unremarkable. He showed up on time, did his work, went home. Katherine, 39, taught 2nd grade at Bellridge Elementary. Her students adored her. She kept a jar of butterscotch candies on her desk and never raised her voice, even when Jeremy Patterson brought his pet frog to class, and it escaped during reading time. They had 2 children. Ethan, 15, played saxophone in the high school band and spent most of his free time in the garage tinkering with an old motorcycle Robert had bought him from a junkyard. He was gangly, all elbows and awkward smiles, the kind of teenager who hadn't quite grown into himself yet. His younger sister Lily was 9 years old, gap-toothed and perpetually covered in paint stains from the art projects she created with manic enthusiasm. She wanted to be a veterinarian, or maybe an astronaut, or possibly both, she told anyone who would listen. By all accounts, they were ordinary, happy even. Not the kind of family that vanished into thin air. But on the morning of December 8, 1988, when Katherine's colleague, Patricia Hoffman, arrived at the Hartley home after Katherine failed to show up for work and didn't answer her phone, she found something that would haunt her for the rest of her life. The front door was wide open. Not just unlocked. Open, swinging gently in the bitter wind, snow dusting the entryway floor where it had blown inside during the night. The temperature had dropped to 14 degrees. Patricia called out, her breath visible in the freezing air, but received no response. She stepped inside, her boots crunching on the thin layer of snow that had accumulated on the hardwood. The house was silent. Not empty silent, wrong silent. The kind of silence that presses against your eardrums and makes your instincts scream that something terrible has happened. The television was on in the living room, playing static, because the programming had ended hours ago. A half-eaten bowl of popcorn sat on the coffee table, kernels scattered across the cushions of the couch. In the kitchen, dinner dishes were still on the table. 4 plates, 4 glasses. Meatloaf, mashed potatoes, and green beans, all stone cold. And 3 of the plates had been partially eaten. One, the smallest, presumably Lily's, was nearly finished except for the green beans pushed to the side. Coffee sat in the pot, long since gone cold. Upstairs, beds were unmade. Ethan's saxophone case lay open on his bedroom floor, the instrument still inside. Lily's backpack hung on a hook by the front door, her homework folder visible through the open zipper, a math worksheet with gold star sticker attached to the top page. Katherine's purse sat on the kitchen counter, wallet inside, $43 in cash still tucked in the billfold. Robert's truck keys hung on the rack by the door. Nothing was missing. Nothing was disturbed. And nothing suggested a struggle. The Hartley family had simply vanished mid-evening, leaving behind a life interrupted so suddenly it looked like they might walk back through the door at any moment. Patricia Hoffman called the police at 8:47 a.m. Sheriff Douglas Maitland arrived 12 minutes later with Deputy Frank Kowalski. Both men had known the Hartleys for years. Douglas had gone to high school with Robert. Frank's daughter was in Katherine's class. They searched the house top to bottom. They checked the basement, a cramped concrete space filled with storage boxes and Robert's tools. They checked the attic, finding only Christmas decorations and old photo albums. They searched the garage where Robert's Chevy sat parked, engine cold. Ethan's motorcycle was there too, partially disassembled. They found no signs of forced entry, no broken windows, no jimmied locks. The back door was locked from the inside. So were all the windows except one in the upstairs bathroom, which Katherine always left cracked open because the fan was broken and the mirror fogged up after showers. By noon, word had spread through Bellridge like wildfire. By 2 p.m., volunteers had organized search parties. They combed the woods behind the Hartley property, calling out names until their voices went hoarse. They checked the creek that ran 3 miles east, worried someone had fallen through thin ice. They searched the old mining tunnels in the foothills, dangerous and unstable but sometimes used by teenagers looking for a thrill. Nothing. Nothing. The Montana State Police were called in by the evening of December 8th. By December 9th, the FBI had opened a case file. By December 10th, the story had made regional news. By December 12th, it was national. 4 people do not disappear without a trace, the news anchors said. Not an entire family. Not in America. Not in 1988. But they had. They had. The investigation quickly became the largest search operation in Montana state history. Over 400 volunteers participated. Helicopters with thermal imaging cameras swept the surrounding wilderness. The bloodhounds tracked scents from clothing items, but lost the trail at the edge of the property line, near the tree line, where the scent simply stopped, as if the Hartleys had been plucked from existence. Theories spread like wildfire through Bellridge and beyond. Some believed Robert had snapped, killed his family, and hidden the bodies before taking his own life somewhere in the vast wilderness. But Robert had no history of violence, no psychiatric issues, no financial problems, no affairs. Nothing in his background suggested a man capable of familicide. Others thought Katherine had orchestrated their disappearance, though for what reason no one could say. She had no secret bank accounts, no history of instability, no reason to run. Kidnapping seemed impossible. 4 people, simultaneously, with no witnesses, no ransom demand, no evidence of a struggle. That defied logic. That defied logic. Then there were the darker theories. Cult activity, human trafficking, serial killers. The woods of Montana held their share of secrets, and the late 80s had seen a surge in satanic panic across rural America. Some locals whispered about strange lights seen in the forest weeks before the disappearance. Others mentioned finding animal carcasses arranged in odd patterns near the old logging roads. But these were ghost stories, the kind of talk that emerges when rational explanations fail. The FBI interviewed everyone in Bellridge, and they polygraphed Robert's co-workers, Katherine's fellow teachers, neighbors, friends, distant relatives. Everyone passed. Everyone had alibis. Everyone seemed genuinely shocked and devastated. They investigated the Hartleys' phone records. The last call made from the house was at 6:14 p.m. on December 7th, when Katherine had called her mother in Billings to discuss Christmas plans. It had been a normal conversation, cheerful even. No indication anything was wrong. They examined financial records. No unusual withdrawals, no suspicious purchases. The last transaction on Robert's credit card was for gas on December 6th, $12.38 at the Chevron on Main Street. They processed the house for forensics, and the pan. They found the Hartleys' fingerprints, as expected. They found no one else's. No blood, no hair samples that didn't belong to the family. The house was clean in a way that seemed almost impossible. Too clean, some investigators noted, as if someone had been very, very careful. But careful about what? 3 weeks into the investigation, on December 29th, A hunter named Victor Delgado found something in the woods approximately 4 miles northwest of the Hartley property. He had been tracking an elk when his dog started barking frantically at the base of a massive Douglas fir. There, half buried in snow and dead leaves, Victor found a child's shoe, small, pink, with Velcro straps and a unicorn on the side. Lily Hartley's shoe. Katherine had bought them for her daughter in September, a back-to-school treat. Patricia Hoffman confirmed the shoes. She had complimented them the first day of school. The FBI descended on the area. They established a grid search pattern, bringing in cadaver dogs and more volunteers. They searched for days, expanding the radius mile by mile. They found nothing else. Not the matching shoe. Not clothing, not remains. Just one small pink shoe, sitting alone in the wilderness like a breadcrumb leading nowhere. And the discovery reignited media attention. It also reignited fear. If Lily had been in those woods, where was she now? Where was the rest of her family? Had they been separated? Were they running from something? Running to something? Or had something taken them? The investigation continued through January, February, March. Tips flooded in from across the country. Possible sightings in Idaho, Wyoming, North Dakota, none panned out. All of them dead ends. The Hartleys had not gotten on a bus. They had not checked into a motel. They had not crossed any borders. It was as if they had stepped out of their home and into oblivion. By summer of 1989, the case had gone cold. The FBI maintained an open file, but active investigation had ceased. Sheriff Maitland kept searching on his own time, driving forest roads late at night, shining his spotlight into the trees, hoping against hope he might see something everyone else had missed. But he never did. Bellridge tried to move on, but the Hartley house became a monument to unanswered questions. No one would buy it. It sat empty, the yellow siding fading to a sickly cream, the lawn growing wild, the maple tree eventually dying from disease. Children dared each other to touch the front door on Halloween. Adults avoided Pinewood Drive altogether. The town had changed. Doors that once stayed unlocked now had deadbolts. Parents who once let their children roam free now kept them close. The sense of safety that had defined Bellridge for generations was gone, stolen by whatever had taken the Hartleys into the night. Years passed. A decade. 2. The case became legend. True crime enthusiasts picked over the details on early internet forums, then later on podcasts and YouTube channels. Every theory had been examined, debated, dismissed. No new evidence emerged. The FBI file gathered dust in a storage facility in Helena. Robert Hartley's mother passed away in 1997, never knowing what happened to her son. Katherine's father died in 2003, dementia having taken his memories long before death took his body. He had forgotten his daughter disappeared, which some said was a mercy. Ethan would have been 45 years old in 2018. Lily would have been 39, old enough to have families of their own, old enough to have lived full lives. Instead, they remained frozen in time, 15 and 9 forever, smiling from missing person posters that had long since yellowed and curled at the edges. By 2024, the Hartley disappearance was considered one of the great unsolved mysteries of the 20th century. It was featured in documentaries. It had its own Wikipedia page. Amateur sleuths still visited Bellridge, taking photos of the abandoned house, walking the woods where Lily's shoe was found, hoping to be the one who finally solved the puzzle. No one expected any resolution. Not after 36 years. Cold cases that old rarely got solved. Witnesses died. Evidence degraded. Memory faded. The world moved on, even when the questions remained. But in March of 2024, something happened that changed everything. A wildfire swept through the mountains northwest of Bellridge, burning thousands of acres. It took 3 weeks to contain. When the smoke finally cleared and Forest Service crews began assessing the damage, a team working in a particularly remote section, miles from any trail or road, found something that should not have been there. A structure. Man-made, partially collapsed, but unmistakably intentional. It was underground, dug into the side of a hill and reinforced with timber and corrugated metal. A bunker or something like it. The fire had burned away the concealing brush and trees, exposing what had been hidden for decades. The Forest Service contacted local authorities. Local authorities contacted state police. State police contacted the FBI. Special Agent Victoria Brennan, who had been 11 years old when the Hartleys disappeared and who had written her college thesis on the case, caught the assignment. She drove to Bellridge on March 23, 2024, late with a team of forensic specialists and a feeling in her gut that she was about to reopen a wound that had never properly healed. The structure was approximately 10 feet by 12 feet, with a ceiling barely 6 feet high. The entrance had been covered with a wooden door that had rotted mostly away. Inside, the air smelled of earth and decay and something else, something chemical, preserved. They found a camping stove, canned food, decades old, labels faded but still readable, a sleeping bag torn and stained, a lantern, a plastic jug that had once held water, and in the corner, wrapped in a tarp that had somehow remained mostly intact, they found bones, small bones. Then, the remains were sent to the FBI laboratory in Quantico for analysis. Dental records were pulled from archives. DNA was extracted and compared to samples taken from the Hartley home in 1988, samples that had been carefully preserved in case this day ever came. The identification took 3 weeks. On April 15, 2024, the FBI held a press conference. Special Agent Brennan stood at a podium in front of cameras from every major news network, her expression carefully neutral, and confirmed what everyone had been dreading. The remains belonged to Lily Hartley. She had been 9 years old. She had wanted to be a veterinarian or an astronaut. She had been dead for 36 years. But the press conference did not end there, because the forensic analysis had revealed something that made no sense. Something that transformed the case from a tragic mystery into something far stranger, far more disturbing, far more impossible to comprehend. Lily Hartley had not died in December of 1988. According to bone development, tissue degradation, and isotope analysis, Lily had survived in that underground structure for approximately 8 to 14 months after the family disappeared. Alone in the dark, in the wilderness, miles from help, and a 9-year-old child, surviving for over a year in conditions that should have killed her within days. The medical examiner's report noted evidence of malnutrition, repeated injuries that had healed badly, and something else that made Victoria Brennan's blood run cold when she read it. Signs of restraint. Ligature marks on the wrists and ankles, visible in the bone structure where healing had occurred improperly. Lily had been tied up, repeatedly for extended periods. Someone had kept her there. Someone had kept her alive. And then, for reasons unknown, that someone had let her die. The discovery of Lily's remains answered one question but raised 1,000 more. Where were Robert, Katherine, and Ethan? Had they been in the bunker too? Had they died elsewhere? Were they buried in the woods, waiting to be found? Or had something even more sinister occurred? And perhaps most chilling of all, who had built that structure? Who had taken the Hartleys? Who had kept a little girl captive in the darkness for over a year? The FBI reopened the investigation with renewed urgency. They brought in ground-penetrating radar to scan the surrounding area. They used cadaver dogs, more advanced than those available in 1988. They interviewed the few remaining witnesses who were still alive, now elderly, their memories clouded by time. They examined the structure itself with technology that had not existed in the 80s. And they found tool marks on the timber supports. They found fibers from rope and fabric. But they found something scratched into the metal wall near where Lily's remains had been found. Words, carved crudely with something sharp. The letters uneven, desperate. He comes at night. 4 words that sent ice through every investigator's veins. Lily had written that. A 9-year-old girl alone in the dark, knowing something was coming for her. Something, or someone. The question that haunted Victoria Brennan, that kept her awake long after she should have been sleeping, was simple and terrible. What had Lily been so afraid of? And more importantly, was it still out there? The discovery of Lily Hartley's remains and the message she had carved into the metal walls sent shockwaves through the investigation. Special Agent Victoria Brennan stood in the remnants of that underground structure on a cold April morning in 2024, staring at those 4 desperate words, and felt the weight of 36 years of unanswered questions pressing down on her shoulders. He comes at night. The forensic team had photographed the scratching from every angle, analyzed the depth and pattern of the marks. They determined Lily had used something thin and metal, possibly a nail or piece of wire, and had carved the message over multiple attempts. Some letters were deeper than others, but some wavered, as if her hand had been shaking. The timeline suggested she had written it weeks, maybe months, before her death, which meant she had been alive, aware and terrified for an extended period of time. Victoria had worked dozens of cases in her 15-year career with the FBI. She had seen the aftermath of violence, the remnants of cruelty, the evidence of humanity at its absolute worst. But something about this case felt different. Personal, maybe, because she had grown up hearing about the Hartley disappearance. Or maybe it was the image she could not shake from her mind, a 9-year-old girl, alone in the darkness, scratching a warning into metal with fingers that must have bled from the effort. And the ground-penetrating radar survey of the surrounding area took 11 days. They scanned in a radius of 2 miles from the bunker, looking for anomalies in the soil that might indicate graves or other structures. They found 3 areas of interest. The first was 30 yards northeast of the bunker. When the excavation team carefully removed the topsoil and decades of accumulated forest debris, they found what remained of a fire pit. Long cold, filled in with dirt and leaves, but unmistakable. Around it they found fragments of bone. Animal bone, analysis would later confirm. Deer, rabbit, squirrel. Someone had been cooking game meat here, and recently enough that not all the evidence had degraded. Recently enough that carbon dating put the last fire sometime in the early 2000s. That's 20 years ago. 15 years after the Hartleys disappeared. Someone had been using this site long after the family vanished. The second area of interest was 60 yards west. It was another depression in the earth, smaller than the bunker, but clearly man-made. When they excavated, they found the collapsed remains of what appeared to be a root cellar or storage cache. Inside, protected by a waterproof tarp that had mostly disintegrated, they found clothing. Adult clothing. A man's flannel shirt, size large. Jeans, waist 34. Work boots, size 11. Robert Hartley had worn size 11 boots. The clothing was sent for DNA analysis. The results came back positive. The shirt had belonged to Robert Hartley. But there was something else. Something that made the evidence techs call Victoria immediately, their voices tight with confusion. The clothing showed signs of wear consistent with extended use. The knees of the jeans were worn thin. The elbows of the shirt had been patched, crudely with different fabric. These were not clothes that had been removed and buried immediately. These were clothes that had been worn repeatedly for months or possibly years after December 7, 1988. Robert Hartley had been alive long enough to wear holes in his jeans. The third area of interest was the one that changed everything. It was 140 yards south of the bunker, in a small clearing that the fire had scorched but not completely destroyed. The radar had picked up a large metallic signature buried approximately 4 feet below the surface. The excavation team approached it carefully, unsure what they would find. What they found was a van. Not just any van. A 1979 Ford Econoline, dark blue, with Montana plates. It had been driven into a pit that someone had dug by hand, a massive undertaking that must have taken days or weeks. Then it had been covered over, buried, hidden beneath earth and transplanted vegetation that had taken root and made the ground above look undisturbed. The van had been there for decades. When they finally hauled it out of the ground and pried open the rusted doors, they found the interior was empty except for one thing. And a wallet. Driver's license inside. Expired in 1992. The photo showed a man in his mid-40s with a thick beard and cold eyes that stared at the camera without expression. His name was Leonard Pryor, age 47 at the time the license was issued. Address listed as a P.O. box in Whitefish, Montana, approximately 90 miles northwest of Bellridge. Victoria ran his name through every database available. What came back made her stomach turn. Leonard Pryor had a record, not a long one but significant. In 1972, he had been arrested for assault in Idaho. Charges were dropped when the victim failed to appear in court. In 1979, he had been questioned in connection with a missing person case in Washington state. A 22-year-old woman named Denise Whitmore who had disappeared while camping alone. No charges filed, insufficient evidence. But in 1983, he had been arrested again, this time in Oregon for trespassing on private property. He claimed he was a survivalist living off the grid. He served 90 days in county jail. After that, his trail went cold. No arrests, no citations, no credit card transactions, no bank records, no tax returns. Leonard Pryor had vanished from society sometime in the mid-80s, which was not uncommon for people who rejected modern life and retreated into the wilderness. But now they had his van buried 140 yards from where Lily Hartley had died. Victoria obtained photos of Pryor from his arrest records. She showed them to the elderly residents of Bellridge who had been adults in 1988, the ones whose memories might still hold fragments of that time. Most did not recognize him. A few thought maybe they had seen him around, perhaps at the hardware store or getting gas, but could not be certain. 36 years was a long time, and Leonard Pryor had the kind of face that did not stand out. Average height, average build, brown hair, brown eyes, forgettable, which in retrospect seemed like exactly the kind of person who could move through a small town without raising suspicion. The investigation intensified. Victoria's team pulled property records for the entire county, looking for any connection between Pryor and the land where the bunker had been found. It was federal forest land, no private owner, but there were logging roads that crisscrossed the area, some dating back to the 1950s. One of those roads, now completely overgrown and invisible, unless you knew where to look, passed within half a mile of the bunker site. They obtained satellite imagery going back as far as records existed. The grainy photos from 1990, enhanced by modern software, they could just barely make out what might have been a vehicle on that old logging road. The resolution was too poor to identify it definitively, but it was consistent with the size and shape of a van. They searched for living relatives of Leonard Pryor. His parents were both deceased. He had a sister, Margaret, who lived in a nursing home in Spokane, Washington. Victoria drove there herself to interview her. Margaret was 79 years old, her mind still sharp despite her failing body. She sat in a wheelchair by a window overlooking a garden and told Victoria that she had not spoken to her brother since 1981. He had shown up at her house that year, unannounced, looking thin and wild-eyed. He told her he was done with civilization, done with rules, done with people telling him how to live. He was going into the mountains, he said, and he was never coming back. Did he ever mention Bellridge? Victoria asked. Margaret shook her head. Leonard never told me where he was going. He said it was better if no one knew. Said the government was watching. Said society was going to collapse and only people like him would survive. She paused, her gnarled hands folding in her lap. He was always strange, even as a boy. Liked to hurt things. Small things at first, insects, then mice, then the neighbor's cat. Our parents took him to doctors, but back then they did not understand people like Leonard. They just said he would grow out of it. But did he? Victoria asked quietly. Margaret met her eyes. What do you think? The more Victoria learned about Leonard Pryor, the clearer the picture became. He was a man who rejected society but who also could not completely sever himself from it. That he needed supplies, tools, food he could not hunt or grow, which meant periodic trips to small towns, places where he could buy what he needed without drawing attention, places like Bellridge. The FBI obtained records from every business in Bellridge that had existed in the 80s. Most had long since closed or been sold, their records destroyed or lost. But the hardware store, Mitchell's Hardware and Supply, had been owned by the same family since 1953. The current owner, Dennis Mitchell, was the grandson of the founder. He showed Victoria boxes of old receipts and ledgers stored in the basement, yellowed with age and smelling of mildew. It took 3 days of searching, but they found it. A receipt dated November 4th, 1988. Cash sale. 50 feet of rope, a box of nails, 2 tarps, a camping lantern, and 3 10-gallon water jugs. No name on the receipt, but Dennis's grandfather had made a note in the margin, the kind of shorthand business owners use. Bearded guy Van. 1 month before the Hartleys disappeared, Leonard Pryor had been in Bellridge buying supplies. Supplies consistent with someone preparing to hold people captive. The evidence was circumstantial but mounting. The FBI worked with psychological profilers to construct a theory of what had happened that December night in 1988. Leonard Pryor was a survivalist who had been living in the mountains for years, isolated, paranoid, and likely suffering from untreated mental illness. He ventured into Bellridge periodically for supplies, but at some point he saw the Hartley family. Perhaps Katherine, pretty and kind, caught his attention. Perhaps he watched them, learned their routines, decided they would be his. The profile suggested he was delusional, possibly believing he was saving them from the collapse of civilization he was certain was coming. On December 7th, 1988, he entered their home. How, they could not be certain. Perhaps he picked the lock, but perhaps he posed as someone in need of help and they let him in. However it happened, he held them at gunpoint, forced them into his van, and drove them to the bunker he had prepared. But something went wrong. Maybe Robert fought back. Maybe Ethan tried to protect his mother. The profile suggested violence occurred, probably quickly, probably in the chaos of trying to control 4 terrified people in an underground space barely big enough to stand up in. Robert and Katherine died first. Ethan probably died trying to save his sister. And Lily, small, quiet, too young to be a physical threat, survived. For a while, Pryor kept her alive, possibly because she reminded him of something, or someone, or because his fractured mind had convinced himself he was protecting her. He brought her food. He tied her up to keep her from escaping. He came at night, just as she had written, because his paranoia made him afraid to move during the day when he might be seen. Months passed. A year, maybe more. Lily survived on whatever scraps he brought her, alone in the darkness, her mind slowly breaking under the isolation and terror. And then, for reasons unknown, he stopped coming. But perhaps he died. Perhaps he simply forgot about her. Perhaps his delusion shifted and she no longer fit into it. But Lily Hartley died alone, tied up in a bunker in the woods, probably from dehydration or starvation or exposure when the temperature dropped too low to survive. She was 9 years old, and the theory fit the evidence, but it was still just a theory, and they needed to find Leonard Pryor, or his remains, to confirm it. They needed to find Robert, Katherine, and Ethan. The search expanded. Cadaver dogs and ground-penetrating radar covered miles of forest. They found nothing. If Pryor had buried the rest of the Hartley family, he had done it well. But in late May of 2024, a hiker named Troy Vasquez was exploring a canyon system 12 miles north of the bunker site, at an area so remote and treacherous that few people ever ventured there. He was photographing wildlife when he noticed something unusual wedged in a crevice between 2 large boulders. He climbed closer and found a backpack, ancient and rotted, barely holding together. Inside was a notebook. The pages were water-damaged, many completely illegible, but some sections had been protected by plastic bags the writer had placed them in. The handwriting was erratic, sometimes neat, sometimes barely more than scrawls. But it was readable. The notebook belonged to Leonard Pryor. It was a journal or a confession, or the ramblings of a mind that had long since lost its grip on reality. The entries were not dated, but context suggested they spanned from some time in the late 80s through the mid-90s. The earliest entries talked about his philosophy, his rejection of the modern world, his belief that he was one of the few who understood what was coming. He wrote about his bunker, his preparations, his certainty that he would survive when everyone else perished. Then the entries shifted. He wrote about seeing a family in town, and a beautiful woman. Perfect, pure, unspoiled by the corruption of civilization. He convinced himself he was meant to save her, to bring her to his sanctuary before the end came. He wrote about taking them, about how easy it was, about how they screamed at first but then understood, he was certain they understood, that he was protecting them. Then the entries became darker, confused. He wrote about mistakes, about things going wrong, about how some of them did not understand, would not listen, would not see the truth he was showing them. He wrote about having to make hard choices. He never explicitly described what those hard choices were, but the implications were clear and horrifying. The later entries were almost incomprehensible. Fragments of sentences, accusations against unseen enemies, the paranoid rants about being watched, being hunted, being tested by forces he could not name. He wrote about the girl, the small one, the one who cried. He wrote that he brought her food, but she was weak, ungrateful, did not understand that he had saved her. And the final entry that was legible was dated, in his erratic handwriting, as spring 1990. She stopped crying. Maybe she understands now. Maybe she finally sees. I will check on her when the thaw comes. The snow is too deep now. She will wait. She is patient. I taught her patience. There were more pages after that, but they were too damaged to read. The notebook ended there. Preserved by chance in a place Pryor must have hidden it before something happened to him. They never found his body. Perhaps he fell in the canyon and was consumed by scavengers. Perhaps he wandered into the wilderness during a storm and froze. Perhaps his paranoia drove him to take his own life somewhere so remote that nature reclaimed him completely. Leonard Pryor vanished, just as the Hartleys had, but unlike them, no one searched for him. No one mourned. No one filed a missing person report. He disappeared into the same wilderness he had worshipped, and it swallowed him without a trace. The search for Robert, Katherine, and Ethan continued through the summer of 2024. In August, another discovery was made. A collapsed sinkhole, 2 miles east of the bunker, had opened up during heavy spring rains. At the bottom, 20 feet down, they found skeletal remains. 3 people, 2 adults, 1 adolescent, buried together in what appeared to be a natural cave system that had been deliberately collapsed, possibly with explosives, to seal it. DNA testing confirmed what everyone already knew. Robert Hartley, Katherine Hartley, Ethan Hartley. All 3 showed signs of trauma consistent with gunshot wounds. The medical examiner estimated they had been dead since late December 1988 or early January 1989. They had died quickly, within hours or days of being taken, which was the only mercy in a story that had none. Lily had been kept alive while her family lay dead in a cave miles away, hidden where she would never find them, even if she had somehow managed to escape. On September 15, 2024, the FBI held a final press conference. Special Agent Victoria Brennan stood at the podium, older now than when this had all begun, and announced that the Hartley case was officially closed. And the remains of the entire family had been recovered. Positive identifications had been made. The perpetrator, Leonard Pryor, was deceased, though his body had not been recovered. The evidence overwhelmingly supported the conclusion that he had abducted and murdered the Hartley family in December of 1988. Lily's remains were released to distant relatives, second cousins who had never met her but who agreed to give her a proper burial. She was laid to rest in Riverside Cemetery in Bellridge on a gray October afternoon, in a plot next to where Robert, Katherine, and Ethan had been buried weeks earlier. The entire town attended. More than 2,000 people stood in the drizzling rain, watching as 4 caskets were lowered into the ground, finally together after 36 years apart. The house on Pinewood Drive was demolished by the county in November of 2024. It had sat empty for so long that it had become structurally unsound, a monument to tragedy that the town no longer wanted to see. He tore it down in 3 days and planted grass over the foundation. By the following spring, you could not tell a house had ever stood there. But the questions remained. Victoria Brennan sat in her office in Helena on a cold evening in January of 2025, reading through the case file one last time before archiving it permanently. 36 years of investigation, hundreds of interviews, thousands of pages of evidence. And at the end of it all, they had found the Hartleys, but they had not found peace, because some things did not make sense. But Leonard Pryor's journal mentioned the family, but he never wrote about burying 3 of them in a cave system miles from his bunker. He never wrote about using explosives. The collapse of that cave required knowledge and resources that a paranoid survivalist living alone in the wilderness should not have had. And there were the fire pits. Carbon dated to the early 2000s, 15 years after Pryor's last legible journal entry. Someone had been using that area long after he should have been gone. Victoria pulled up the photos of the bunker again, studying them on her computer screen. She zoomed in on the message Lily had carved. He comes at night. Not they, not men, not people. He, Jerry Jones, was angry and singular. The two. But what if it was not singular? What if Leonard Pryor had not been alone? Survivalist communities existed in the Montana wilderness. Scattered groups of people who rejected society and lived off the grid, sometimes peacefully, sometimes not. What if Pryor had been part of something larger? What if someone had helped him take the Hartleys? What if someone had helped him hide the bodies? What if someone else was still out there? Victoria closed the file. The case was solved, officially. The families had closure, officially. But in the quiet of her office, with the wind howling outside and the darkness pressing against the windows, she could not shake the feeling that they were missing something. Something important. Something that was still waiting in the woods. In Bellridge, the town tried to move forward. The Hartley case was solved, or as solved as it would ever be. The documentaries would continue to be made. The true crime channels would dissect every detail. The theories would persist online, because that is what happens with cases like this. People do not want simple answers. They want complexity, mystery, the thrill of thinking they know something that everyone else missed. But for the people who lived in Bellridge, who had known the Hartleys, who had searched the woods in the bitter cold of December 1988, calling their names into the darkness, there was no thrill. There was only grief. And occasionally late at night, when the wind picked up and the forest pressed close against the edge of town, there was fear. Because every few years, someone reported seeing lights in the woods where the bunker had been. Moving lights, like flashlights or lanterns, deep in the trees where no one should be. Every few years, a hiker went missing in those mountains. Usually they were found, sometimes days later, disoriented but alive. And sometimes they were not found at all. And in 2023, 1 year before Lily's remains were discovered, a forest ranger named Paul Hendricks filed a report about finding a structure in the woods 30 miles north of Bellridge, underground, concealed, and when other rangers went to investigate, they could not find it. Hendricks insisted he knew where it was, led them to the spot, but there was nothing there, just undisturbed forest. He was placed on administrative leave, evaluated by a psychiatrist, and eventually retired early. But he knew what he had seen. And sometimes, late at night, Victoria Brennan wondered if he had been telling the truth. The official story was complete. The Hartley family was gone. Leonard Pryor was dead. Justice, such as it was, had been served. But in the vast wilderness of Montana, where the mountains stretch for hundreds of miles and the forests hold secrets that will never be found, there are places where the light does not reach. Places where someone who wants to vanish can vanish. Places where someone who wants to hide can hide. And if you go into those woods, if you venture far enough from the trails and the roads and the safety of civilization, you might find something you were not looking for. You might see lights where there should be no lights. You might hear sounds that do not belong to any animal you can name. You might find signs that someone was there, recently watching, waiting. And if you are unlucky enough to camp in the wrong place, to sleep too deeply, to let your guard down for just a moment, you might wake up and realize that something has changed, that something is wrong, and that someone is standing just outside the circle of your firelight, patient and still, waiting for you to notice them, waiting for the right moment. Then because he comes at night. And in the darkness of the Montana wilderness, night lasts a very, very long time.